Hi, I'm Suzanne O'Callaghan, Policy Research and Education Manager at Haemophilia Foundation Australia. Welcome everyone to our fourth webinar in the series for Bleeding Disorders Awareness Month. A few housekeeping notes. We're recording this session and are currently live on Facebook as well. Our speakers are happy to answer questions from the audience during the panel discussion. You can ask questions in the Q&A feature if you're joining us live via Zoom, or by putting your questions in the comments if you're on Facebook Live. Bleeding Disorders Awareness Month is a time for us, our community and our other stakeholders to take part in activities and raise awareness around Australia about bleeding disorders, including haemophilia, von Willebrand disease and rare inherited bleeding disorders. The theme of our month is One Community, Many Faces. We've been showcasing different topics and ages and stages during the month, and don't forget to keep an eye out on our social media platforms and website for what's happening. Our webinar today is on your rights relating to superannuation and insurance if you have a bleeding disorder. Now, this is a hot topic in the bleeding disorders community, and we're very pleased to have our expert panel who have joined us to discuss some of the issues around superannuation and insurance. And that includes life, income protection and travel insurance. So today we have with us Jane Portnoy, haemophilia social worker at the Ronald Saw's Haemophilia Centre at the Alfred in Melbourne, who will give us an introduction with some of the issues experienced in the bleeding disorders community. We have Laura Davies, superannuation and insurance lawyer at Morris Blackburn Lawyers in Melbourne, who will give us an overview of your rights with superannuation and insurance. And we have Dr. Stephanie Pung, haematologist and haemophilia treatment centre director at the Fiona Stanley Hospital in Perth, and Megan Walsh, clinical nurse consultant at the Ronald Saw's Haemophilia Centre at the Alfred in Melbourne. And they'll join the expert panel to discuss some case studies and answer questions from the audience. And as I mentioned, if you're in the audience and have any questions, there's two ways you can send them to us. If you're joining us via Zoom, put your questions in the Q&A feature. If you're joining us via Facebook Live, put your questions in the comments. And your questions will be passed on to the expert panel to answer. Now, I just want to show you something. Here we go. Sorry, this is an important note to notice that any advice or comments during this webinar are general principles, and you should always seek individual professional advice about your personal situation before you make any decisions. So I'll just stop sharing now. Okay, so sorry, it's one of those things that you need to make clear. So now I'd like to hand over to Jane Portnoy to give us an introduction about the issues with superannuation insurance in the bleeding disorders community. So over to you, Jane.
Hi, everybody. It's great that HFA is putting on this session. That's a really important topic. And I think it is one that doesn't get enough of our thoughts and time. So thank you. I hope that lots of you out there are watching, and I know that having it recorded means it's available for many that want to watch it at different times. I guess superannuation and insurance are not your sexy topics. It's not about all the fun stuff that you can do now or the starting new treatments, but it is really important if you're thinking about your future and your or even if you want to have a great holiday, it gives you a chance to plan and prepare so that if anything goes wrong, you are protected. You will have healthcare when you need it and you're in some strange place, or your family will be looked after. If you can't work, your mortgage will get paid, that sort of thing. For many of us, we might not think about it as much as we need. And super, we just hope that there's going to be enough money to get us through our old age. Doesn't your boss just put money into your super? Like, do you really have to think about it? Well, actually, I think it's been a saviour for many people in their time of need, and certainly lots of our oldies in our community are reaping the benefits of their careful planning now. Some of our generation obviously are more fiscally responsible, and they will plan and save and prepare, and they will get the benefits later on. I think for the bleeding disorders community, you have a difficulty because you have some barriers to getting insurance, and you also have some barriers to work. So you might not slip into a full-time job as easily, and those things that others will do might not happen, like enrolling in a superannuation. It works more likely to be part-time or casual, and so it's just a little bit trickier and a little bit more sporadic for some, where you can work for a bit and then you might have to take more time off. Many times patients have mentioned that they've tried to get insurance and that they get turned away or rejected, and they give up at that point. I think it's really important to say you can shop around, and often we hear and we know that there is opportunities for insurance. It's just a little bit more time consuming for the person who wants the insurance. So the shopping around has got a bit easier with the internet, and you can go online and have a look. Travel insurance is something I do often with patients when they are planning big trips, and I know that lots do it themselves. You don't need your social worker sitting with you, but sometimes it's great to have that help. It's really important to declare your bleeding disorder and any other pre-existing conditions, because if you don't, you can have your insurance voided, and that is awful when you think you're protected and then all of a sudden it's not available. I think that with superannuation, sometimes people think that they've decided they're going to retire early, and so it's a foregone conclusion that they'll be able to access their superannuation, and they put in their application and they're all hopeful that it's not going to be a problem, they can retire early, and that there'll be this money that will go into paying off their debt or for their mortgage. And back comes the reply from the company, and it says, no, you're not eligible to get your super at this early stage. So I think at that point, it's very important to know what the rules are around super and to not give up, because there are chances to, once you work out what the rules are, to get a doctor's letter and say, look, this is my situation. I need some extra support so that I can pay off this bill and be in a better position to not work. And sometimes you do need help from someone like Laura to communicate with the insurance company. Sometimes it's not that complex and you can get the letters yourself, but at other times, and I know that lots of our patients have had good success when they've pursued these things, and that's been really helpful. With haemophilia, the retirement might come earlier. So, accessing your super is not going to be the same as the general population. And that's why we know that understanding the rules around your super are all that much more important. And so the income protection insurance and life insurance are other insurances that people have a challenge with. And the same thing goes, there are opportunities with like partnering insurances. So if you have a superannuation, sometimes you can get life insurance that is not contingent on any health assessments, and getting the advice about that can be from a broker or from the companies themselves or from a financial advisor, and that can be really great in giving you the chance to have that protection for your family and for yourself if you're wanting to have life insurance, and with income protection insurance. I think insurance is something most people are able to get, and it is really important for people in the bleeding disorders community to have the ability to access that and have that security to do that. It is something that is much easier to do when you are well and younger. So I'd also encourage our community to think about it in the earlier stages so that you can have more options and less high premiums. There's always help from your psychosocial workers or social workers, or in your haemophilia treatment centres or in your local community. And I'm always happy if people would like to locate who they could talk to. There's also community financial counsellors who do not have ties to getting kickbacks or benefits from recommending anything, and they are wonderful at helping advise you along your pathway to your secure sort of financial state. So anyway, I wish everybody all the best, and it's great talking with you all, hopefully in person in the near future. All the best.
So thanks, Jane, for highlighting some of the experiences of people with bleeding disorders and some of the very important aspects of what we're hoping to cover tonight. So now I'd like to introduce Laura Davies, the superannuation and insurance lawyer at Morris Blackburn Lawyers in Melbourne. Now, Laura has more than 10 years legal experience in superannuation and insurance claims. She has expert skills in this area of law, including total and permanent disability, that's TPD, total and temporary disability, TTD, life and death insurance, trauma, income protection and salary continuance claims. So Laura's going to outline your rights and options with superannuation and insurance. So over to you, Laura.
Hi, everyone. And thank you, Suzanne, for inviting me here tonight. I agree with much of what Jane said. So I work here at the Superannuation and Insurance Department at Morris Blackburn. Most of the work we do includes running the claims for an insured, and quite often a lot of them can go through quite smoothly, but we do see a lot of files that come to us when a claim has been rejected or a policy has been avoided. We don't ordinarily have the benefit of having these types of discussions with people before they go through the application for insurance process. So what we often see is insurers purporting to decline a claim and avoid a policy because they've looked back to an application for insurance and determined that the insured failed to disclose or made a misrepresentation regarding their health or their circumstances. So often the insurer might say that had they known about this at the time, then they wouldn't have agreed to grant that cover and accept that risk. An insurer might say that they wouldn't have offered insurance on any terms, or they might say that they would have buried the cover or applied an exclusion. So if they are avoiding the policy altogether, it might even be in circumstances where the person's disability to which they are making the claim has nothing to do with the alleged non-disclosure or the misrepresentation. So for example, you could be lodging a claim for a back injury, but when the insurer looks back through medical records prior to the application, they might see some other illnesses or injuries which weren't disclosed. And then they might say, well, had we have known about this, we wouldn't have insured you in any event. So the best thing to do if you are put on notice that an insurer is proposing to reject your claim or avoid a policy is to seek legal advice as early as possible. So there might be a very valid reason why something wasn't disclosed, and the insurer's position must be supported by their underwriting materials. So it is best to get advice from someone who knows what to request from the insurer in terms of what sort of documents they're relying on. There are various issues to consider, including the wording of the Insurance Contracts Act at the time the policy was incepted, but also when the insurer is avoiding the policy. So something to consider when they're looking at if there was a misrepresentation or a non-disclosure. There has actually been some recent reform in this area, which took effect from the 5th of October last year. So the wording prior to that of Section 21 of the Insurance Contracts Act effectively required an insured to disclose every matter which the insured knew or a reasonable person in their circumstances ought to have known to be a matter that is relevant to the insurer's decision to accept the risk, and if so, on what terms. So I guess the difficulty with that is trying to put yourself in an insurer's shoes. So with the recent change to the consumer for insurance contracts, the test now is whether the consumer's misrepresentation was made as a result of a failure to take reasonable care when responding to a question. So that test has been somewhat simplified. In terms of applying for insurance, all of this can be avoided by making sure the questions are read and answered carefully. So, we're always in a rush, and there will be a number of tick boxes that you have to go through. And it is easy to just skim through, but you really must take reasonable care and properly answer the questions. Don't just look for the obvious blood conditions question. Look out for the other questions, such as family history. That will have a number of conditions which might not be relevant to you, but it will also have somewhere in amongst that a question which says something like, or any other hereditary disorder. It might also have another section which says any other medical conditions that we need to be aware of. I think the best way to think about it is, when in doubt, always disclose. An insurer might still approve the application, but they might just apply a premium loading or an exclusion. As Jane touched on as well, there is insurance through your superannuation, which is really important. So there are insurance policies through superannuation that offer levels of default cover, which provides insurance without the need for medical disclosure. And that is usually age-based cover. So that is, there are certain levels that are automatically offered, and disclosure is only required if someone is applying for additional units of cover on top of that. People should seek financial advice about what fund might be more suitable for them if they think underwriting is likely to be an issue. I would strongly urge everyone to check what cover you currently have within your super. Is it enough? Can you increase it without going through underwriting? Have a look at your policy. There might be life event cover opportunities to increase without disclosure. So an example of that is if you take out a mortgage or the birth of a child, there might be an opportunity to increase your existing cover without having to go through a medical disclosure form. There's usually a pretty strict time limit with that. So an example might be, you might have to do it within 90 days of taking out the mortgage or the birth. Another thing I would say is look out for tricky clauses that might impact your eligibility. So for example, if you're in casual employment, that might change the TPD definition that you're assessed against. Or are you in a high risk occupation? We do see some policies which provide a different test, and that might be, rather than your ability to return to suitable work, it might consider your ability to perform the activities of daily living. So that's something to be aware of. Know what you are currently covered for. If you change funds when you start a new job, are there rules that impact, how quickly you must do this? If you are working part-time or you are winding down, there might be a requirement to remain in active employment. So we do sometimes see where people start to reduce their hours. It's a really good idea to familiarise yourself with your insurance policy, because we do see policies where if the person might be working, say, less than 15 hours per week, then again, they might be assessed under a more difficult definition to satisfy. I know travel insurance is an area of interest. Again, read the questions carefully. When in doubt, disclose. Because when a claim is made, the insurance company will request medical records, and a policy will not cover costs relating to a pre-existing medical condition that the person was aware of unless they told the insurer about that condition and the insurer agreed to accept that risk. So they're the main points I just wanted to get across to everyone. Really important that you check the insurance that you currently have within your super, and I'd be happy to answer any other questions as well.
Okay, thanks, Laura. Okay. So now what I'd like to do is that's a very helpful outline, and I think what I'd like to do now is we're going to look at a few case studies to start with, where we might apply some of these things that are options that have come up and look more closely at how it might work. So I'll invite all of the expert panel to turn themselves on and join the discussion. Okay. And right. Okay, so on our expert panel, we have, just a reminder, we have Laura Davies from Morris Blackburn Lawyers. We have Jane Portnoy, social worker, and Megan Walsh, clinical nurse consultant, both at the Haemophilia Treatment Centre in Melbourne, and Dr. Stephanie Pung, haematologist and Haemophilia Treatment Centre Director in Perth. And once again, just a reminder that any advice or comments during this webinar are general principles, and you should seek individual professional advice about your personal situation before you make any decisions. So, okay, so I'll get all our panel to turn on their, well, maybe they can unmute themselves when they're ready to talk, but our first case study is Sarah. She's 38 years old and has type 1 von Willebrand disease, the mild form. She's had few bleeds in her lifetime, apart from heavy menstrual bleeding, which is managed with a Mirena IUD. So she applies for travel insurance to go to the USA. She's very good, and she discloses her von Willebrand disease, but then she's told she'll need to pay a higher premium. So I thought I'd start this discussion by asking Steph. So Sarah has mild von Willebrand. So what is there to worry about if she's travelling to the US? You know, she's got mild von Willebrand.
I guess it sounds like she doesn't really have too much of a history of bleeding other than the heavy periods. So yeah, I agree. I mean, it depends really, again, what activities she's going to be involved in. But from a normal everyday, if she was living in the US, I would presume it would be like her living in Australia, and she would hopefully not be encountering too many extra problems in terms of bleeding than otherwise. I presume if she is doing some extra physical activity in her holiday, then if she injures herself, then I guess that would be the problem in terms of an increased risk of bleeding, which may become problematic if she was in a remote place. Usually, however, with the type 1 von Willebrand patients, if they injure themselves, their levels should go up with that acute injury, acute inflammation. So hopefully it shouldn't impact too much on sort of excessive bleeding. But, you know, I mean, you can certainly not exclude the fact that it will potentially increase her risk of bleeding, which if she's hiking the Grand Canyon, for example, may become problematic.
Yeah. Okay, now I just know that there's some really good stories from Megan. Megan, do you want to give some examples of what you know happens to people when they go on holidays? Like just things in the US, for example. What have you heard about things, very briefly, not specific individuals, but just kind of things that might happen?
US notoriously is the most expensive healthcare in the world, and so I mean, you just have to. As soon as you, I mean, my sister's lived there and took a baby, and they just, as soon as you walk into ED, they just start sticking things everywhere and charging you like winded bulls. The thing with the USA also is different states have different rules. So we've found that some states with drinking alcohol, their rules are over 21. And so we've found one or two people have got caught with that. So if you are under 21 and injure yourself and present to a hospital, you're automatically tested straight away for an alcohol level. And if you do have an alcohol level and in that state you're under 21, and that is then illegal, and you can have your travel insurance voided. And so we have seen that with people that've been in hospital and been told, just found out your insurance has been voided. This is the bill. And it's a very big bill. So yeah, we just have to be a little bit careful. What other things sort of?
Well, I think one of the things that you often commented to me is about what things that happen that people never would expect to happen. So they go on holidays and things happen.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, you plan for the worst and hope for the best. But I don't know, with people with haemophilia, sometimes they just at the wrong place at the wrong time. I mean, we've had someone who was in Vietnam and he was in a market, and this motorcycle was out of control, came around a corner. Now it's a crowded market. Who did they hit? The person with haemophilia. And you can just, people fall over, and then suddenly they've got a beetle, they've fallen out of a bunk. They're in a hostel and they're fallen out of a bunk. And things like, you've got to be very careful when you go to places like Bali and Vietnam. Everyone loves going on the motorcycles, but you actually have to have an Australian motorcycle license, because if you don't and you have an accident, you are not covered. The insurance will not cover you. You also have to be careful in those sort of places. I mean, if you're admitted to hospital, you have to be able to pay the bill, or else they won't release you. I've had a patient in the Philippines going, I'm a prisoner. I'm going, what do you mean you're a prisoner? He said, until the bill's paid, they won't let me out. And he didn't have insurance. I mean, one really important thing when you go into countries that don't have great medical care is to have medical evacuation on your travel insurance. That's absolutely essential. We did have an instance where there was an uninsured person and they had quite a significant injury, needed to medevac, and then when everything was prepared, they realised that there was no insurance, and it was going to cost 80 to 100,000 to medevac back to Australia. It ended up with intensive care bills in another country and family having to fly over with products. So it can become quite complicated, but that medevac insurance, you really need to check it. It needs to be, sometimes it's like around 50,000, but you really need about 80 to 100,000 to get you back to Australia safely, and often with an accompanying person as well. So one thing you really do need to look at.
Now, a question for Laura. One thing I've heard people with mild conditions sort of speculate, particularly women speculate about, is would they disclose? Now, what can you say about a pre-existing condition with travel insurance and disclosure?
I think if you're having to ask yourself the question whether something needs to be disclosed, generally the answer is yes. Shop around, ask questions. Like I said earlier, when you are in doubt, you must disclose. All of the conversations you have with the insurer prior to taking out the policy will likely be recorded and can be relied upon later. So it's really good to be able to show that you asked those questions. Read the fine print as well. You may have the insurance, but the activities that you plan to undertake, are they covered as well? So I think, just echoing what Megan said, just have to be really cautious and disclose in the circumstances. And it might be that they are willing to cover you for everything else but a pre-existing condition, or there might be a premium loading. It just depends on the insurers, and their thresholds for risk does vary across the industry. So it is important to shop around.
So there might be some who, if you're finding the premiums for everybody are too high, that you might be able to discuss with them not covering for your bleeding disorder. And
yeah, exactly. And also, they'll have different definitions of what is a pre-existing condition. Is it a diagnosed condition? Is it something that has been present within a certain time leading up to the application? So I think they're all the things that you need to make sure you understand when you're completing the application. What do they consider a pre-existing condition? Because that can vary across the industry as well.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking, the question about not covering and Megan's comments about everything that could go wrong and the medivacing and stuff like that. Like you really want to make sure that you have tried every single option, don't you? So shopping around.
Yeah. I mean, often your credit card has insurance. So if you booked your travel through your credit card, they often offer insurance, and it's often quite competitive. Some of the patients have found it to use the insurance linked to your bank or credit card. Your health insurance also offers travel insurance. So if you're in private insurance, you can actually get insurance through there. But you really do need to shop around. I mean, some people come back and go, oh, the premium is enormous. And you say, well, try this one. But we try not to just keep recommending one company, because we found the companies start to get a bit jittery if they're continually getting people with haemophilia, and they sort of start pushing back. So we often find there's more success if you actually apply online and just fill out all the questions and then wait for them to come back to you with the questions. Also, if you've got severe haemophilia, the companies love it if you're actually taking product with you. So you often regard it quite well if you say, I'm actually taking my treatment product with me. Then they're sort of a bit happier that they're not going to be flying around the world trying to find product and things. So they often will ask you that.
Jane, did you want to say something? You need to unmute yourself.
So we often facilitate people going overseas by actually giving them a product in order to try and at least cover a little bit of a bleed. Obviously, product equals volume in their bag, so they don't want to be taking too much. But yeah, they're usually pretty comfortable with it. And we obviously provide them a letter to get through customs, etc.
Okay, yeah, so documentation is really important. Jane, what did you want to add?
I was just going to jump in and say, I know for some people, particularly as you get maybe more problems and more kind of pre-existing conditions, the insurance can be hard. And Laura's idea about getting an insurance policy that covers you for other things, but not maybe your pre-existing condition, you should talk to your doctor and see if that's a reasonable kind of idea, or if that's leaving you exposed. But the other thing is, we have reciprocal rights with some countries, which is for emergency care. It's not for just everyday care. But I know that I've had personal experience in Greece, and it was fully covered. So it is that you could perhaps do a combined insurance where something wasn't covered, but you knew that you were going to a country that you could have emergency care. So, there are ways for more complicated situations. And I'm really aware that the situation for all of our patients gets more and more complicated, and it precludes them from accessing what everyone else would be able to access. So I want our patients, people that we know, to have that opportunity to travel, to have that security. So I encourage you to, start talking and thinking with your team, with your go online and apply and see what happens. And I'd actually wanted to ask Laura about the privacy stuff, because I know when you're applying for pre-existing conditions and your travel insurance, you give a lot of information, and it actually takes quite a significant amount of time, and you might have to do that multiple times. And I just was wondering about that. What are patients' rights or consumers' rights, I guess, with insurance when you are just trying to find out if you're going to be covered?
Yeah, that's a good question. And you're right, it can, once you do disclose a pre-existing condition, they might then want to go back and access your clinical records and just find out, much more about that condition. Really, it is essential for them to be able to make a decision on whether to accept the risk. But I do find with travel insurance, the pre-existing condition is generally a lot more straightforward than it is with other insurance products. So it as provided it's something that is present prior to the application, it will generally be excluded unless they agree to actually insure it. So the answer is yes, you do have to disclose it, and they are entitled to get that information, unfortunately.
Okay, now I'd like to move on to another case study so we can start looking at some of the issues around life insurance. But before I do that, was there anything burning that people wanted to say about travel insurance before we move on? I did want to say there was a fabulous travel webinar that was we had a bit earlier. So if people want to look more at travel issues, they can have a look.
There's also Smart Traveller. I don't know if Helen mentioned that. If you go to smarttraveller.com.gov.au, they have all the 12 countries that have reciprocal rights. Sometimes you actually have to take certain documentation with you to access care overseas, or you have to fill out some forms and stuff before you go. So it's a good idea to read Smart Traveller if you're going to certain countries to see what care you can access and what you need to take with you.
Yeah, and we've got a great section on travel that Megan helped write. So I'll put the link up to that in a second. Okay, so on to our second, our next case study. So Paul is 40 years old. He has severe haemophilia. He's been working full time. He has a mortgage and children at school. He's a qualified roof plumber, but with haemophilia arthropathy, that's arthritis related to haemophilia, his joints have deteriorated so much he can't climb a ladder anymore and he can't do his job. So he's decided to stop working but would need to draw on his superannuation. He has industry superannuation and was refused access to it as they said he could still work. So what's his recourse? Over to Laura.
Yeah, look, this is probably the most common issue we see day to day. So he should definitely seek legal advice. The test regarding whether he can still work is subject to the wording of the particular insurance policy that applies to him. So it is often the case that the definition considers the person's likelihood of returning to suitable employment within their education, training and experience. So consideration must be given to, realistic prospects, taking into account, restrictions. Can you do this work? You can't really do this work on light duties. It's basically non-existent. So when he's going through the claims process, there will be a medical attendance statement for his doctor to fill in, and the doctor will answer the questions on the form, but there will be a number of questions where the doctor can put any real limitations that are going to impact his ability to return to work. And if he's someone that's always been a roof plumber and he can't do that manual work anymore, then his prospects of getting sedentary employment are going to be really limited because it's not within his education, training and experience. And we do often see, insurers suggesting that they can return to work that just doesn't fit within their work history. So this is something that we see a lot of, and it's generally an issue that we can overcome.
Okay, does anyone else have anything else to add to that? Any other comments on that case study? No? All right, well, let's go to another one. So Vikram is 27 years old and he has severe haemophilia. He decides to take up self-employment and applies for income protection insurance. He's very fit and active. He's on new therapies and hasn't had a bleed in a couple of years. In the application, he had to answer questions about his health condition and management with a medical letter from his doctor, but he's told he'll need to pay a higher premium. Now, Laura, I'm just wondering if you can explain to us how actuaries work and why they might make a decision, like how do they make these kinds of decisions about who needs to pay higher premiums and who doesn't?
Yeah. So it is a circumstance where you can request the actuarial or statistical data that the insurer is relying upon, which identifies that the condition would lead to a greater risk of claims being lodged. If that information is not available, they need to show that they have discriminated, but they need to show that it's reasonable having regard to any other factors. Actuarial data should be updated with medical progress, but this can take time. And also it can be difficult to get this information from the insurer. So again, it might be another point where you would seek some legal advice. I would say as well, income protection is probably the toughest in terms of getting insurance. Generally is most difficult in terms of exclusions and things like that. But again, a lot of superannuation funds do offer default automatic income protection insurance, and it's still quite significant insurance. So that's something that people can also look into as well.
So, Steph, why might I'm just thinking that new therapies, you know, if they're looking at data and what might happen in the future, why might insurers be very cautious about how they might decide what a new therapy means for someone?
I guess there's, I mean, most of the patients now with severe haemophilia, well, a large volume of them will be on emicizumab, and the annualized bleeding rate can be 1 to 2, like 1 to 2 per year at the most. So I guess in a way, the risk should be, it's a dramatically different landscape, but we really don't have a lot of years of use. So maybe the actual data has to be is based upon historical bleeds, etc., etc. So, for example, most of the patients in WA would have been on it for at the most a year. Between 6 to 12 months would be the majority of the patients. So, in the literature, there has been. So, I guess the Haven studies the first one was published in 2017. So there's not really a lot of historical data that these guys then analyze in order to get their justification data to assess their insurance costs. So maybe that's limiting the process potentially. But yeah, I think probably in the future, the environment and the circumstances may very well be different.
Okay. Does anyone else have any other comments about that case study? Okay, well, I guess one of the questions that's come up quite a lot is about navigating the situation where people have been refused in the past and now they are thinking they'd like to try again. I think there's a question here. I've applied for life insurance previously but was turned down on the basis of having severe haemophilia. I was under the impression from the broker that no insurers would provide life insurance to the bleeding disorders community. Is there a list of insurers who are known to offer such coverage for us? And I think, Laura, you've brought up the default insurance. Did you want to make any other comments about that?
Yeah, again, I think it's a situation where the person should consider seeking financial advice to find options that may offer an adequate level of automatic insurance, which is not subject to the underwriting. And it is important to remember that if you are working already, you will likely automatically have TPD and death or terminal illness that would cover you for your condition, even if it did pre-exist the commencement of the cover. And you may also want to apply to increase that through super, but you would need to disclose that condition, and then the insurer would determine whether they are willing to insure you above a certain amount. And it might be that they still will, but they might put a higher premium loading or exclude any claims that relate to that condition. Again, every insurer's underwriting process is different, and therefore the risk that they are prepared to take on varies depending on the insurer as well. And again, with a lot of the questions, you might actually have a condition, but if it hasn't been a problem, or you haven't had to seek treatment within, the last 3 years, or depending on the wording of the question, they might still be willing to insure you. When we do access underwriting material, we do see that they might have some sort of point system where, the person might have up to a certain number of questions that they can say yes to before they're voided. So it really does depend on the application.
Okay. All right. Now we're so running close to time. I just had one more question that is a little bit of a tricky one, but it's come up before. It's about genetic testing for females, and a woman has said, I'm an obligate haemophilia carrier. My father has haemophilia, therefore I must be a carrier. And I have normal factor levels and no symptoms. I've never had genetic testing before because I don't need to. I'm applying for life insurance, but I've been asked if I have had genetic testing, and if so, what the gene mutation is. I actually do know what the family mutation is because, it's part of our family knowledge, and, I need it for my children. Do I have to disclose it? So I think that's one for Laura.
Yeah, look, I do think that the condition should be disclosed. Circumstances don't always fit neatly into a question. And I think that if she was to explain that she has the normal factor levels, has no symptoms, it might actually it might prompt the insurer to then access medical records and see that it hasn't been an issue in the past, and they might still be willing to take on that risk. If you don't disclose it, when it comes time to claiming, the insurer will likely argue, when the person makes a claim, that reasonable care wasn't taken with answering that question. So I think that, yes, if she explains the situation, it might not even impact the application, but it should be disclosed.
Okay, thanks very much.
Can I just tack on to the back of that and say, I think these applications are really complex and pretty challenging not because the actual question's challenging, but because of all that it makes you think about, and because of all of your history and your family and the things and maybe just the fact that you've been rejected or had a difficult insurance experience before. Having somebody go along through that process with you, just sitting with you while you're doing it online, or, if you've got someone who's good at admin and good at reading questions, or, you're not quite sure about the meaning of things, it can be a huge help in getting these processes done. So I really encourage all of our community to do it, do it with your partner, do it with your clever, kid who's at uni, or somebody that you've got in your life, or one of the professionals in your HTC if you need to, as a way to just be successful in getting through that process.
Yeah, I agree. I would just add as well on that point is, like I touched on, there could be a very innocent reason why something wasn't disclosed. And how often do you go to the doctor and they might be looking into something, or you might get blood test results but you don't really understand what they mean, and a lot of notes make sense to a doctor but not necessarily to you. And I think sometimes when you look at a claim that's been rejected, sometimes you can form an opinion on it, but then when you speak to the person and they explain to you what their thought process was when they answered that question, it makes perfect sense. And you can say, well, yeah, they did take care. This was what they understood their history to be.
Laura, can I just say, like, we've seen patients and they've been asked for the mutation in the family. The thing is, some of these mutations have a risk of having inhibitors, which is makes them quite expensive. Mm-hmm. But they might not have, may never have that. So it's quite difficult being asked to put that forward and then be judged on something that it may never influence them at all.
Yeah. Look, I understand that, and I think as well, if you can give a clear picture that yes, that there is this, but it may never actually impact me or add any risk to the insurer, then if they do decline you, you can say, well, where is that data that you're relying upon to make that assessment? I'd like to see it.
Yeah, because I find it hard that insurance companies would have drilled down to that sort of information.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Did you want to?
And just a bit of just throw a spanner in the works. You know, who knows whether or not that girl actually has the genetic mutation.
Yeah.
You know, we're not going to be too fussy about that. And I mean, realistically, even if she did test and she the fact that she knows is actually kind of family privilege, but actually she probably shouldn't really know what somebody else's genetic mutation is, if you get what I'm saying.
Yeah. Well, that's a curly one. Do we want to leave it there, or does anyone want to make any last comments about that?
Well, I suppose other genetic conditions, does everyone in the family know who's a carrier and who's not? I mean, that's the thing, isn't it? It's sort of tricky sometimes.
And I think as well, when you're answering the family history question, you can only answer what you know or what you understand it to be. So I think as well, and sometimes even just answering it as best you can, it shows that you have taken reasonable care with answering that question and you haven't just ignored it altogether.
Yeah. Well,
oh, sorry. I was just going to say.
Go on. I was just about to wrap up. So if you want to say something more, please do.
I will add, when I mentioned earlier, when it can often come down to timing. So in some circumstances, so if the insurer's avoiding a policy more than 3 years after it's being incepted, then it's a difficult test for them to satisfy. They have to show that the person was fraudulent in failing to answer that question or making that misrepresentation. So I would always say, if you are put on notice that they are looking to avoid a policy or vary it, certainly seek legal advice, because like I said, there may be a very reasonable explanation.
Okay. Now, I've put some links up on our website. There's a bit about disclosure where there's more information about following up some of these things. But I would like to thank all of the panel for talking through some of these very complex issues. And once again, please note that any advice or comments during this webinar are just general principles, and you should always seek individual professional advice about your personal situation before you make any decisions. And that might mean going to a lawyer, or it might mean talking to your psychosocial worker or your nurse or your doctor about getting a bit more information. But yes, important to follow it up. So there's some more information links in chat. I'd like to thank all the speakers with us tonight. So Laura, Jane, Megan and Steph, thank you very much for giving up your time and being part of this discussion. This has been a very important topic to discuss, and one which is very relevant to many people in our community at various times in their life. And just the number of questions that came up, which were all along these lines when I raised this with some of the focus groups. So very glad that we had this opportunity to discuss it. So thank you, everyone, and good night. Okay.
Thank you.